Welcome to AP Biology. Today I want to talk to you about endothermic animals and how they're able to regulate their body temperature using cellular respiration. This is an elk, and you can see it with an infrared camera at night, and you can see that it has body heat. So let's define them first. Endotherm. An endotherm is an animal that produces its own body heat, and it maintains a constant internal temperature. So, for example, our body temperature is 98 degrees Fahrenheit or 37 degrees Celsius. We usually just call them warm-blooded animals, and it takes energy for them to stay warm, or for us to stay warm. Warm-blooded animals are mammals and birds. And if you live in a cold place, like I do in the wintertime, you'll look out the window and you'll see birds in the wintertime, and you'll see squirrels, and if you're lucky, sometimes deer outside. But you don't see snakes in the wintertime. You don't see frogs in the wintertime. Those are ectotherms. So their body temperature fluctuates with the environment. We also call them cold-blooded animals. So examples of those, these are examples. Examples of cold-blooded animals would be reptiles, fish, amphibians, bugs. That's not really a term, but insects. So if you look at this graph, we're looking at body temperature compared to environmental temperature. So here it's cold, and the warm-blooded animal is warm, and here it's warm, and the warm-blooded animal is still warm. So they maintain a constant body temperature, pretty much always the same. And it could be, different for different animals, but it looks like a mouse and humans are pretty much the same. Lizards, on the other hand, when it's cold outside, environmental temp, when it's cold outside, they're cold. And when it's warm outside, they're warm. And so their body temperature fluctuates, here it is, changing with the environment. So when it's cold, their metabolic rate is going to be very slow because their enzymes don't have as much activation energy as they need to make the reactions go more quickly. So how does all that work? It works with an uncoupling protein in your inner mitochondrial membrane. So let's review what the inner mitochondrial membrane looks like. So this is the electron transport chain. And so you burn your food. Oops. You burn your fuel, your food, and when you do that, you rip off the electrons and you put them onto a delivery molecule like NADH. And NADH takes the electrons from your food and brings them to the electron transport chain. And those electrons are moved from carrier to carrier to carrier to carrier, and finally they go on to oxygen, the final electron acceptor, who takes those electrons with some hydrogen ions and makes water. So that's the electron transport chain. As you go this way, the molecules become more electronegative. They pull those electrons in tighter toward themselves, which means when they're at a lower energy level, they have less energy. So that energy was used to do something. What was that energy used to do? Well, the energy was used to pump protons against their concentration gradient. So electrons moved through the carriers, but protons are being pumped over to the intramembrane space. So if we're looking at a mitochondrion, here it is. The intermembrane space is this spot. So this is the place that's getting all those protons being built up. It gets very acidic. So here are your protons, and we're going to call this a proton gradient. That proton gradient is really potential energy. So it's a charge separation. So just like a battery has a positive side and a negative side, this difference between out here and in here, that's a gradient. And that gradient is just like a battery, it's potential energy. And so when you need to make ATP, the protons, let me move this, those protons are going to move through ATP synthase. They're going to go high to low. So there's a lot of them here. They're going to move out to where there's not so many of them. When they do that, it's like water falling over a dam. So just like water can move a water wheel, we have protons moving out, and that twists this molecule. And as ATP synthase, as this molecule twists, it's able to change shape, which is able to put a couple of ADPs and Ps together to make ATP when these protons come out. So that's how you make ATP. So it's the energy from food. Darn. Sorry. So it's the energy from food that eventually is converted into ATP. So now let's say you also need energy. Sorry, now let's say you also need heat. Let's say it's cold outside. So when it's cold outside, you instead, aside from making ATP, you'll lose some of that proton gradient here in this uncoupling protein. So here's an uncoupling protein. It means the electron transport chain was coupled, this thing, the electron transport chain was coupled to ATP synthase with the proton gradient. The proton gradient's the thing that connects them, right? The electron transport chain makes, let's do it this way. The electron transport chain makes a proton gradient. Sorry, makes a sorry, I had that right. Makes a proton gradient. And then ATP synthase uses it, right? So they're coupled. The thing that puts them together, the thing that links the electron transport chain with ATP synthase is the proton gradient. And so this thing is called an uncoupling protein. So what does an uncoupling protein do? Well, the protons, instead of going through ATP synthase to make ATP, the protons are just going to go right through this uncoupling proton. It dissipates the proton gradient. It gets rid of the proton gradient. It lets the protons go through kind of for free without making ATP. That energy is lost as heat. And so when those protons go through this uncoupling protein, you're changing the potential energy that was up here, and you're releasing it. You're increasing the entropy in the world. You're increasing heat. So cool, right? So let's just read this through. The uncoupling protein is this. It's a mitochondrial inner membrane protein that dissipates or gets rid of the proton gradient. The energy lost in dissipating the proton gradient is used to generate heat in warm-blooded animals, endotherms like us. So here's a graph that you might see comparing ectotherms, cold-blooded animals, with endotherms, warm-blooded animals. So this is the rate of oxygen consumption, which is directly proportional to cellular respiration, right? Because in cellular respiration, one of the reactants is glucose, but another reactant is oxygen. So if you're using up oxygen, you're doing cellular respiration. So this would be just a small amount of cellular respiration here, and this would be a big amount of cellular respiration here. So if you look at a cold-blooded animal and you're looking at the temperature outside, when it's cold outside, they're not expending very much energy because there's just not enough activation in it. Sorry, I didn't say that right. When it's cold outside, they're not doing very much cellular respiration. In fact, they're not doing much of anything. They're hiding in a hole in the ground because their metabolic reactions are very, very, very slow. Because it's so cold and because they're so cold, they don't have enough activation energy to do any of their reactions very quickly. So their metabolic rate, their cellular respiration, their oxygen consumption is going to be very low. When it's warm outside, they get warm, and now they're able to do a lot more reactions, and they have a higher rate of oxygen consumption. They're now able to have to do a lot of cellular respiration. Totally the opposite for endotherms. See, up here but down here. What's happening with an endotherm is when it's warm outside, right? This is the outside. When it's warm outside, they only need to do enough cellular respiration to make ATP, right? So they have to meet their ATP demands, enough ATP to move sodium across their membranes, enough ATP to contract their muscles, stuff like that. But that's really all they need to do. But when it's cold outside, they've also got to be making enough of a proton gradient to allow that to go through the uncoupling protein to generate heat. So they have to do way, way, way more cellular respiration when it's cold so that they can maintain their body temperature. So I think that intuitively makes a little bit of sense if you think of yourself. If you go outside on a really cold day without a good coat on outside, you're going to be really, really, really cold, and you're working to keep your body temperature up. So you're just expending a whole lot more energy doing this. So you're spending more energy burning more glucose to make a proton gradient so that you can then go ahead and dissipate that gradient to stay warm. So up here, animals are not just making enough ATP, but they also have to do cellular respiration just to stay warm. So ATP plus body heat. Bye.